Welcome everybody to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. I'm Daniel from Boswell. We are so honored on day 4,746 of us being in business to be hosting Lee Kravetz, author of The Confessions of Sylvia P, a seductive literary mystery and multi-generational story inspired by true events and a very, very, very true iconic character. Authors are and reviewers are loving this book. Adam Johnson of The Orphan Master's Son said, Lee Kravetz has created a bit of a miracle, a plot-driven literary puzzle box whose mystery lives in both its winding approach to history and its wondrous story. It's a book full of ideas about inspiration and a love of language that translates across borders, physical and generational. The last Confessions of Sylvia P is Lee Kravetz's latest work, but he is also the author of the acclaimed nonfiction titles Strange Contagion and Super Survivors. And he's also written for print and television, including the New York Times, the Atlantic, and PBS. We are so happy to have one of our absolutely favorite and best conversation partners in Christina Clancy, who is the author of two novels, The Shoulder Season and The Second Home, and holds a PhD from our very own UWM. And what a surprise that two wonderful authors should actually know each other. And my very, very favorite events are of that sort. So welcome to both of you. Welcome to Lee Kravetz and Christina Clancy. Thank you so much for coming. I will disappear now.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Yay. I was so excited, Lee, to have you have the Midwest be part of your book launch, because we have such a special reading community here, and we're all so obsessed with Boswell books. It's really like the beating heart of the east side of Milwaukee, and Daniel is the champion. And I'm glad everyone's here. I'm sorry about my face. I had a little bit of a little skin cancer check thing. Everything's good. They got everything. There's nothing to worry about. So I was going to cancel, but then I thought, for book people, we don't care about vanity, right? Like, it's all in the mind. So anyway, I am thrilled to invite Lee here. I met Lee when we were actually at camp.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, we're both on the board of an organization called Lit Camp. And for those of you who are writers out there, it's my favorite literary conference I've ever been to. I went many years ago, and my book up here, The Second Home, I don't think it would exist if I hadn't gone to Lit Camp, because I was working on it. And then I finally got it far enough along and I decided to go, and I met the people and got the inspiration to keep going with that book and finish it. So I totally credit Lit Camp, and Lee was on the board, and we were camp counselors together. I was doing this, like we did a talent show or something, and I was Counselor Christy, and we sang camp songs. And Lee also, in addition to all the other amazing things that he does, he also plays guitar. So he was playing guitar while I got everybody to sing old camp songs. So we have a really fun background together.
We do. I hope you didn't get the skin cancer stuff from Lit Camp. Probably you did, because it's so sunny and bright in Napa where we do it. But that's it's awesome. I was so excited to be able to, one, be at Boswell, but also to do it with you. You got published, or you were published. You got two novels out before I was actually even able to sort of get to finishing mine. But when I was reading Shoulder Season in particular, just the way you sort of crafted everything and put these beautiful scenes together, and also incorporated history. It's the real history of the Playboy bunnies and but also of the place. There was a real sense of place. It just sort of like you were not only speaking the language of novels, but you were speaking to me in terms of how to craft my book. So I don't think I have to credit you for my book as well in many ways, because I think you just really supported me in sort of just letting me read your stuff. I was just really blown away.
Oh, Lee, I mean, speaking of being blown away, like you do a lot of these events, you get excited about books, but I'm really excited about your book. Like, I love it. And I'll just say, so I'm friends with a writer named Karen Duquesne, and Karen and I are both Cape Cod writers. So she wrote a book called The Last Book Party that takes place in Truro. So she was saying, who should I interview? She does a series in Cape Cod. And I said, Lee, And so one day my phone lit up and she was like, oh my God, thank you for telling me about Lee. And she's a very discerning reader. And I don't really get texts like this from her a ton. She's like, I love this book. And so then I wasn't able to join your conversation with Karen with Castle Hill, but then I just heard afterwards she was like, Lee is amazing. This book is amazing. I'm so excited about this. And then she was like, it's probably one of the best interviews we've ever done. We want him to come teach here. And I mean, that's, for these virtual events, there are a lot of virtual events, but to really stand out like that, it says so much about you and your book. And I mean, this book is, I want you to talk about it in a second, but I just want to say, like, I was captivated by it. It has multiple perspectives. There's like a puzzle in the middle of it. It's literary on a sentence level. It took my breath away. And then there was just so much going on to like craft it on top of the fact that when I was in high school, I was obsessed with the bell jar. I just read that book over and over again and underlined phrases. And so I just felt like it was nostalgic as well to read about it. So one thing I was hoping you could do, Lee, is just for those people who haven't read the book yet, when I've actually been paying a lot of attention to this of like how writers describe their own book. And so if you could like just describe it, like what's your elevator pitch? What's
the elevator pitch. Yeah. So it's always tough. Actually, I help with a lot of writers when they're putting their pitches together. And it is hard. It's really hard to do because a novel is so much more than just one sentence. And I always like, if someone says, what's your book about? You're like, well, it's about this, it's about that, and the other. And you go really, really, really deep. That said, here's my elevator pitch. It's the story of Sylvia Plath and how she came to write her seminal novel, her only novel, The Bell Jar. And it's really about how, when I set out to write this book, it wasn't really going to be about Sylvia Plath. It was about the people who influenced her and sort of led her on her journey toward becoming the writer and the poet that we all sort of know and love today. So we see it from three different perspectives. We see it from the perspective of her psychiatrist, who was a real person. Her name was Dr. Ruth Barnhouse. She's fascinating in real life. She was one of the very first, maybe even the first female psychiatrist in New England in the 1950s. And she runs into Sylvia Plath at McLean Hospital when Sylvia is in her early 20s, or not even barely 20. And she sort of helps her along. And then we get the second perspective, which is 10 years later. And you get a poet named Boston Rhodes, who is a wonderful poet who runs afoul of Sylvia Plath and sees her as a rival. And so we see how that pushes and changes Sylvia. And then we get the third perspective, which is the perspective of a modern day curator at an auction house who comes into contact with something that may or may not be Sylvia Plath's original handwritten notebooks of the bell jar. And so it's really seeing three different sort of storylines that sort of show how Sylvia influences different people in different periods of time.
I love that. And I think what you really get at is how enigmatic she is. Yeah. And, I kept thinking of that. It's Frank Sinatra who said like an enigma wrapped with a bomb with a ribbon wrapped around it or something like that.
That's exactly right.
That's how he described enigma. But I think it's so interesting. Was it hard for you to actually, so I want to talk about how you embody all these characters and why you wrote this book with this kaleidoscopic perspective. But I also was really interested in how you made Sylvia Plath, like what was it like to try to bring Sylvia Plath herself to life? She gets some dialogue, we see her in scenes. Yeah. And I wondered, my friend Stephen Rowley wrote a book called The Editor, where he wrote about Jackie O when she was working as an editor back in the day. And how we've talked about how he tries to bring this incredibly famous person to life and put words in her mouth and try to capture her gestures. What was that like for you? How did you do that?
Oh my gosh, it was super, super fascinating in my mind in terms of how to do it. Because look, when you're writing about somebody like Sylvia Plath, what you're really talking about is you're talking about an icon. You're talking about the golden goose, right? And if you are going to take on somebody as iconic as Sylvia Plath, you've got to do it in a way that's respectful, but also really honest. And so I sort of had a contract with her. I mean, she's been dead for a long time, dead and gone. But I really did. I had, I don't mean to make this sound woo-woo, but it was. I said to her in my head, I was like, if I'm going to do this and use your likeness to make this book, I promise it'll be true. I promise it'll be honest and raw. And that's really holding with the spirit of confessional poetry, which I can talk about in a bit, but it's about being honest and true about even the ugly, ugly parts of your life, but also the beautiful parts. So I set out to, if I was going to write about her, I was going to do it in a way that was honest. And I also knew that sorry, my dog's barking back there. Doing it in a way that was sparing as well, meaning like sparingly. This book was never going to be Sylvia Plath centric. Sylvia Plath is the orbit, like the center of the universe for 3 different stories. And so I knew that when she spoke and when she appeared, it had to be for a reason. It had to be solid and it had to move everything forward. So with her, I was very careful. And I got to use different eras of her life as well. So when I was learning about, she speaks when she's in her 20s at the hospital, when she appears as a patient who's admitted for basically what we call bipolar disorder today, but back then it was called manic depression. And what I did was I read literally every single thing that she wrote when she was that age. I read all of her journals, all of the letters that are published, even the poetry that came out at that time. So you really get the cadence of who she was back then. And you get the vocal tics as well. And that doesn't really show up in all of her letters, but you can almost, like, if you sort of walk around in her skin a little bit, you can almost pick up her mannerisms. So when I'm writing about her in her 20s, she has these sort of vocal mannerisms. She'll say things like, well, if you really want to know. Or she has these sort of, glorifying images and thoughts. And by the way, she's having a manic break. So she's sort of manic in her dialogue. When we meet her again, when she's 10 years older and 30, she's much more in her own self. She's more confident, self-confident, but she still has those vocal tics and she still has those moments of sort of glory and beauty. So I knew that I needed to sort of bring that in to her dialogue as well. But you'll see when you read the novel that it really is, when she appears, it's very specific and very purposeful. And the rest of the dialogue is about her or concerns her or sort of sees her from a distance. We sort of dive into her life and almost as a fly on the wall, wondering who she is. And, she is an enigma. And it's almost like we're watching this person who could be brilliant or could be dangerous, or could be a fraud, or could be all of these things. We're just sort of watching to see what happens next.
And what I love about it is from the other perspectives, and I think we all have this experience in our lives where there's somebody we become kind of obsessed about or who takes up a lot of space in our brains. And it has so much less to do with them than about how we react to them. And I think that you did a brilliant job of showing, especially with Boston Rhodes, who's her nemesis.
Yes.
But they're like friendly, like she doesn't even know that she's her literary nemesis. Sylvia's kind of like oblivious to it, but
That's
Boston Rhodes is just all worked up about that. So I actually really wanted to talk about Boston Rhodes, but before I do, I just remembered, I tilted my screen so you didn't see this. I just want to make sure everyone sees the cover of this book. So I just love it. I remember when you sent it to me, and it has the look of like these old, the notebook that she would have used.
Yes.
So,
exactly.
yeah. So can you talk about Boston Rhodes, her arch rival?
Yeah. So, Boston Rhodes is her rival. When we meet Boston, I love Boston Rhodes. She's an awful human being, but that's what makes her so much fun, right? She is, in 1950s, she is married. She has a kid. She decided that she was going to marry a doctor and she was going to be a mother and the best mother out there. And she's going to be the best wife possible. And she's going to be that's what she's going to be. And in her mind, she fails at all of these things. She's a terrible mother. She's a terrible wife. She's a terrible cook. She's failing on all these fronts until she discovers poetry. And she discovers it almost on accident. She's literally ironing and the TV is on and she's just exhausted. Her kid is screaming and she just feels like an abject failure. And she discovers a PBS show on the sonnet. And from there, she tries her hand at it and she's really good. I mean, she is really good. She's so good that she winds up getting into Robert Lowell's very famous poetry workshop at Boston University, which is a very real thing. And she's there with Maxine Kumin and George Starbuck and all of these very famous, Sam Alberts, all these very famous poets who are in this workshop. And not only is she there, but she is good. I mean, really, really good. Robert Lowell thinks that she's going to, basically lead the movement when it comes to confessional poetry. And she would have if Sylvia Plath hadn't shown up in the class as well. And from there, she engages in this sort of rivalrous sort of war with this very famous poet who happens to be not only Sylvia Plath, but married to a very famous poet herself. And named Ted Hughes, who famously we know. And so we see this sort of rivalry play out over the course of her section of the novel. And she, just kind of discovers her own voice, which she calls a venom voice that really sort of challenges her to become an even better poet than Sylvia Plath.
Yeah, and I think that she's an interesting character because one of the things that you do in the earlier parts of the novel is you're kind of showing this confluence of things that are happening at in that time period in the 50s. So you have like women are just starting to become a little more independent or questioning the status quo. It's not quite the sexual revolution yet, but you can see how they're trying to make a name for themselves in a world where they're being critiqued for how they dress and their husbands and so on. So you show that. You also show the rise of the confessional poetry movement, which I want you to talk about. And then the other thing that's also interesting is, how we treat mental health and how mental health was starting to be seen then. For those who don't know what confessional poetry is, I wonder if you can talk about it. And then I just was, I want to talk about like just poetry in general and like how you're so drawn into this world. And it was so nice for me because I used to read a lot more poetry than I have been lately. And it was really, really great to be plunged back into it because this is the kind of poetry that I grew up like getting hooked on poetry, reading confessional poets. So maybe you could talk about that. And then, and then I have so many other questions. I could just talk to you all night. So let's just go all night. Okay.
You got it. I'm here as long as I'm here until the bar closes. So when we think about confessional poetry, well, let me back up a little bit. I'm not a poet. I didn't understand poetry. I didn't know much about poetry, but I knew just enough about poetry that confessional poetry was sort of in the back of my mind. And so I started out, we'll start off a little bit before I come into the confessional poetry here. I was working in book publishing for a number of years. And I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a novelist. And one of the things that happened was I turned 30 years old and I realized, well, geez, I understand how to write, but I don't know what kind of novelist I want to be and what I want to write about. So what did I do? I went back to grad school and I became a therapist. I got my master's degree in psychology. Cut to a couple of years later, I'm doing my postgraduate work at a mental hospital. It happens to be the exact same mental hospital that Ken Kesey worked at when he was at the Stegner program at Stanford. And he decided to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So it was the same building, the same footprint. And I'm walking in one day into where the patients are, and there's a kiosk with a bunch of books. Well, the books basically to get your mind off of the fact that you're in a mental hospital. So it's really weird to find the bell jar in that sort of kiosk. Because it's ostensibly about how Sylvia Plath, it's a veiled memoir really about how Sylvia Plath becomes, goes to a mental hospital and sort of comes out of it 6 months later. I'm rereading it and I realize that it's not just about Sylvia Plath, a veiled story of her, but it's also a parallel story of the birth of confessional poetry. This just blew my mind. So there's basically a hidden code, a hidden story within the original manuscript of the bell jar. This is absolutely true. In the 1950s, before the 1950s, there were lots of poetry movements. You have things like surrealism, romanticism, the graveyard poets. You have the Cavalier poets, and all of these are sort of either, it's poetry about, sort of locked into political discourse, or nature, or just sort of outside of oneself. Confessional poetry is the poetry of the internal dialogue. What's happening inside your head, how you're feeling, in some ways, how you behave. All of this is called confessional poetry. It's stuff that we don't talk about in public. It's stuff like lust, death, abortion, incest, grief, all of these sorts of things that we don't talk about, certainly not in the 1950s. But then you have someone like Sylvia Plath, who's in a mental hospital, and she comes out of it and she starts writing poetry about her thoughts and feelings. At the same time as poets like Anne Sexton, who was also in a mental hospital for manic depression, came out writing about thoughts and feelings. And Robert Lowell, mental hospital, writes about poetry about thoughts and feelings. Maxine Kumin, W.D. Snodgrass, Marianne Moore. There's all of these sort of poets who have mental illness, and they all are congregating in Boston around this time, and they start to come up with this thing that becomes confessional poetry. It changes everything. It changes everything from that point on, from 1958, 1959, all the way to today. You wouldn't have the memoirs that we have today without confessional poetry, the rock music or the folk music, or any of the poetry, certainly without having confessional poetry first. It broke all of these sort of boundaries.
And then you have this incredible, relationship between mental health and poetry. And I kept wondering if there was some sort of critique that you were kind of knitting into the manuscript of whether the confessional poetry maybe hurt or helped mental health. Like, as someone who has an actual background in mental health and therapy, I wondered what you think about, Boston Rhodes' husband accuses her of being a navel gazer, and thinking that this is just so indulgent to write about all these things. I was reading it and I was thinking, is the poetry making people crazy, or is the poetry a release from, or not? I shouldn't use the word crazy, but from feeling.
No. So it's a great question. In the 50s, you allude to this earlier. What's going on in this time period? And I talk about it, I show it more than I talk about it, but there is a major split in how psychiatric health is dealt with beginning in the 1950s. Up until then, you had the strict Freudians, right? You had the id and the superego and the ego, and you had, analysis that would take years. And if analysis doesn't work, well, you've got electroconvulsive shock therapy and insulin shock therapy, and it works. It totally works. But about the time that Ruth Barnhouse shows up, this is 1952, there is a major movement against Freudian psychology. We start having what's called humanistic psychology, which is we don't just look at the mental illness, we actually see the person who's suffering. And we sort of, and because of that, we don't necessarily do analysis. We don't do the sort of things that strict Freudians would do. We actually, instead, what we do is we walk beside our patients, as opposed to the one up, one down sort of relationship that is strict Freudian psychology. What I really wanted to show was that the art, the activities, the living, showing how we live outside of the mental illness or with the mental illness, that actually gets us outside of what we're experiencing. That is actually the road toward cure. Well, I don't say cure, toward treatment, that strict Freudians also were moving toward, but in very different ways. So, I show Dr. Ruth Barnhouse sort of discovering Sylvia Plath, who comes in so disabled that she can't read and she can't write. She can't even hold a pencil anymore, which is actually true. Sylvia Plath showed up at McLean Hospital completely unable to read and write. And she teaches her how to hold a pencil again. And she teaches her how to go outside of the mental hospital and work with bees and while beekeeping or gardening or leaving the facility with a group and experiencing a life during a snowstorm in downtown Boston, really living experiences and finding a sense of independence. All of that is just as therapeutic and certainly was for Sylvia Plath, as strict Freudian psychology would have been. And in fact, we can even look back and see examples of how the Freudian psychiatric help was not helping her at all.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that Dr. Barnhouse is kind of the emotional center of your book? Is she kind of a hero, would you say?
It's a great question. So if you read the Bell Jar, it's interesting. So Sylvia takes all of the real people in her life and gives them fake names. She even gives herself a fake name as Esther Greenwood. Esther Greenwood, not Esther Greenhouse, Esther Greenwood. And even when she wrote the book originally, she gave herself a fake name on top of that fake name, Victoria Lucas, because it was to hide the evidence that this was real. Mm-hmm. Toward the very, very end of the book, when she's in the hospital, Esther Greenwood's in the hospital, there's a doctor named Dr. Nolan. And Dr. Nolan comes, and she's a very different doctor than every other doctor that she's seen in the novel. She's not the one who pushes her to do things that she doesn't want to do. She's a mother figure. Dr. Nolan in this novel is Dr. Barnhouse in real life. And so when I read The Bell Jar, not just the first time, but the second time as well, to me, Dr. Nolan absolutely was the hero of this novel. She was exactly the figure that Sylvia Plath and Esther Greenwood both desired in their lives, weren't able to find anywhere else. You had her mother and her mother figure within the novel who had so many expectations for Sylvia. The doctors, the male doctors, who all had expectations for Sylvia and for Esther Greenwood. You had all the boys that she was dating or supposed to date or supposed to like dating, all had expectations for her. But Dr. Nolan / Dr. Ruth Barnhouse was the person who sat down with Sylvia and Esther Greenwood, took her by the hand and walked with her side by side through the end of the novel. And any success that Sylvia Plath had outside of McLean Hospital, I absolutely think was, dependent upon Dr. Ruth Barnhouse as a mother figure and a central force in her life. She's absolutely a hero.
Yeah, it's cool how you rescue her in history.
Yeah,
and, give her a role here. It's fun to do that as a writer, isn't it?
It is.
To, bring people. And so one thing you mentioned is that in The Bell Jar, not all the names are the same. Mm-hmm. You use a lot of the same names except for Boston Rhodes. And a lot of people would suspect that Boston Rhodes is actually the poet Anne Sexton. So I'm really curious, how did you choose to keep Boston Rhodes' name separate? Was she kind of like in your mind, was Anne Sexton part of that character, or did Boston Rhodes become a totally separate literary entity to you?
Yeah, so Anne Sexton's DNA is absolutely in Boston Rhodes. You can't separate that. In fact, there was a point where I actually thought to myself, I love Anne Sexton, love her. She's such a great character, was such an interesting person, somebody who was not just didn't have manic depression, but she had the embodiment of that. Some days she was spectacular, and then a minute later she would be awful. And just absolutely awful as a human being, as somebody who was really suffering. And I was like, this is a fascinating person. And there was a moment where I thought to myself that she was going to be the rival character. And so I started writing her. In about draft 5 of the book, I realized I needed Sylvia Plath's rival to be her equal, but also her exact opposite. And so if Sylvia was really, really good, then her rival needed to be really, really capable of some things that were really awful. And Anne Sexton wasn't that person. Anne and Sylvia, if you read their poetry, you can actually see that they have conversations with each other through their poetry. Anne would write a series of poems about beekeeping. And Sylvia would, and then Anne would as well. Sylvia would write about her father. Anne would write about her father. So they were conversing with one another. And so there was that rivalry, but there was also that love. Boston Rhodes needed to start there, but go much, much, much farther. And as soon as I let go of Anne Sexton as my character and Boston Road sort of appeared and emerged, I was like, that's when the novel came alive, because I could throw away the handrails, like I could, or the guardrails. I could just be like, okay, you know what? I can go anywhere with her. And that's when I became a novelist, actually. Beforehand, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say for any writer out there who's watching this, to know that you felt like your novel came alive on the 5th draft.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a remarkable amount of work to do before you get to that point. So if you're working on a novel and you're struggling with it, take heart. Maybe you're just on draft 3.
Oh my God, seriously? So my sweet spot tends to be 11 drafts. It's been that way. So I have 3 books, nonfiction, and this is my first novel. Every single one, I hit my 11th draft, and I'm like, I think this is it. So, and it takes a while. And the first, oh yeah, man, the first 8 drafts, 7 drafts, 8 drafts, I would never look at those again. I mean, they're awful, and they're just they're just not there yet. But 9, 10, 11, that's where things really start to come together.
It is. I mean, I think, I always tell this, but it seems like when you're writing, you're telling yourself the story first. And then you have to think, well, how am I going to reshape this for people who are going to read this? And I think that's part of the reason that those later drafts come through. One thing I've always wanted to ask writers when they talk about all the drafts that they work on, like for you, and Karen said you had a fascinating writing process.
Yeah.
But for you, do you find when you're working, like, do you just slam it out, like just write something from beginning to end? And then with each draft, do you start fresh? Or are you editing in that draft? Like what means draft to you? Because I think it might mean something different to different writers.
I think it does. And everybody has a different process, which is why this question is so much fun to ask, right? Because everyone does. It's taken me years to figure out what my process is, but mine is the first draft, I lay it down. I just basically, I call it the shotgun approach. My first draft is basically an 80 to 100,000 word outline. That's really it. And some chapters are just like, then Boston Roads does this next, so it's basically just, blasting it onto the thing. And then the second draft is usually going back and putting meat to the bones and realizing, wow, this doesn't work. Or, man, I made a connection at the end of the novel. Now I need to kind of draw it back to the first. So I know, to have the through lines go through. And then by the third draft, I go through and I tighten it to the point where I can sort of like get rid of the eraser marks. And I blow it out, and then I read it from start to finish. I have my designated readers read it as well, and then I look at the problems, and the problems are usually significant, like really significant. And 4, 5, and 6 are fixing all of those problems. And every time I do that, I have to go back and I'm rereading everything and making the language tighter and adding scenes and taking scenes away and finding scenes that just don't work, scenes that I don't even need anymore because there's not enough tension, there's not enough drama, there's not enough dialogue, or not dialogue, there's not enough need, there's not enough psychological sort of need or moral need going on. There's something that's not working, or I can combine the two. And then this is where it gets really interesting in my mind. The voice. Through all of these drafts, I'm working on the voice. Each character, especially in this novel, there's 3 major point of view characters, and each one of these point of view characters has a very specific voice. It takes me 6 drafts to really even understand what that voice is. And Karen was talking about my process. I really do. I walk around with my phone, and it's sort of method acting. And for each draft takes a number of months, but I can tell you, for about 11 months or 10 months for each character, I am walking around in that character's voice, and I am using my recorder and recording into my phone observations and even storytelling points. Like, this is what I see, and I will do it almost with Boston Roads. I would do it with her voice, and I'd get her body language and her sort of motion and her idiosyncratic sort of walk. That's the point in draft 6, 7, and 8 that I am laying down the voice, and I'm tweaking and changing every single line of the book. I'm basically rewriting and retranscribing every line of the book, but using the right voice. And that's when the novel starts to really come together.
Oh, that is so fascinating, because It is, some writers, are also bricklayers where they're just really slow and methodical. I think I'm a little bit more like that. And I'm thinking I should maybe try to be more like you and just get the story down. So the language is so precise and so beautiful.
Yeah.
Do you feel like in those early drafts you have that beautiful language? Or are you not focused on language concerns? You're just focused on story.
It's at that point, it's all almost a dreamlike state. It really is. It's go wherever you want. There is a like I have my influences like Michael Chabon. If you read Michael Chabon's work, every sentence is just he comes at a subject from the opposite direction, and then the image sort of flows, and it's almost like all of his great sentences have every sense in them. It has taste, touch, feel. I mean, every sentence is three-dimensional, sometimes four-dimensional. It's so there. The only way for me anyway to get there is to sort of allow myself in those early drafts to almost be dreamlike and just sort of go wherever I'm going. And what winds up happening is eventually draft 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a lot of that falls away. And what's left are what I like to call diamond sentences, whether it's dialogue or it's description. And then you start playing around with it. So it is absolutely a very, very sort of methodical process. But you have to start from that dreamlike state. Otherwise, they'll just never show up.
Well, it's fascinating. And that actually it dovetails nicely into a question that Christina Powers has. And hi, Christina. And she was asking, how did you approach balancing the different perspectives of the book? And do you feel you gave enough balance in the overall story you were wanting to tell? So I think that question of balance, now I want to like kind of add on to Christina's question and just wonder like, at what point did you start worrying about the balance concerns? Because that's also so interesting.
So this is a great question. Thank you for asking it. It's a great question. Anybody who hasn't read the book yet, basically there's 3 storylines and they're all sort of locked like this. So you got, and they're told backwards in time too. So I did somersaults to get this right. And it's modern day, 1960 or 1959, and then 1952. And then they alternate. And so there's a math to it. I heard somebody say this in one of the interviews I did, but it's true. It's actually, he was right. I actually wrote not 1 novel, not 2 novels, but I wrote 3 novels. And each novel, there's certain structure to novels when you're writing, a fictional piece of work where you have, different acts and you have different, rising action, you have tension, you have inciting incidents, you have conflict, and so all these sort of things have to happen in a novel for it to actually take shape. And what I did was I did it 3 times, but then I had to make each story talk to each other, even though they were separate. So I did that by blending them. And so one story up here would mention a poem. The second story here, you see the recitation of the poem. Down here, the third story, you'd have the inspiration for the poem. And then you go back up to this one, and all the information you gain from these 3 stories informs this chapter here. And so it became like clockwork. I'm not a mathematician at all. I don't understand math, but I understood the balance and how it felt. And every single time my agent or my editor came back with a change, it changed everything because everything was so intricately designed. And so if, they were like, well, this doesn't make sense here, to have to make a little change here, but then I have to go through the entire novel to fix everything because it was so tightly wound. But the balance was super key to everything from the very beginning. It was a massive puzzle.
And the hard work you put into this book is what's going to give this book legs, and it's going to stick around, and people are going to read it, and they're going to ask their friends to read it, and they're going to want to talk about it in their book clubs because it's not just something you just wrote to be like commercially successful, or it doesn't feel whimsical at all. It feels like something that was like living inside your brain for a really long time, and you were really careful with how you wrote it. Did you ever feel when you were working, like, what was it like working with your editor? And did you ever have to push back? Because you're such an owner of this story, and is it easier for you to push back because you used to work in publishing?
Actually, you know what? It's the exact opposite. Actually, the one thing that I've learned, and then we're going into craft here a lot, but this is fascinating to me. That's so. Here's the one thing I learned: the minute that you can let go of your story and give it to trusted readers, trusted editors, that's the key to success. Like genuinely, if I had gone out with the original version of this book, which is the one I turned into my agent, and he saw something in it, I would have been awfully humiliated, because if it came out, it would have been awful, because the best work is not just your solo. You have to be, able and willing to sort of take the criticism, take the feedback, and work with it. And obviously there are moments where I'm like, no, I don't agree with this or that or the other. But I'll tell you, I have a wonderful team. My agent and my editorial team, I mean, just they're so wonderful. And they would come back, and this is true, they would send me pages of notes. And the first round was awful. I actually took about 48 hours just to sort of process it all. And I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. This is wrong. They don't get the story. They're absolutely, their instincts on this are way off. And then I try it. And damn it, they were right.
Yeah.
They were absolutely right every single time. And I learned to trust them the way that they learned to trust me. So that was really it. It was this a level of humility and graciousness, and an understanding that this is really sensitive stuff when you're working on something that's a passion project. In order to take it from a passion project to something that's a viable living thing that works the way this, I think, works, it needed that. And it's something that I embrace. I can't wait to get to draft 8 of my new novel, give it to my editor and my agent so they can beat the crap out of it and send it back, send me reeling, and then start polishing it and bringing it to where it needs to be.
It is so nice to be able to have a good relationship with your editor and trust that they're invested in it. And I would think that your editorial team is maybe specially invested in this book because we all are so invested in Sylvia Plath. Like I don't know any writer out there who hasn't been moved and influenced by the work of all these poets, and who there's, I remember when I was getting my PhD, I took a lot of poetry classes, and you had to do that because you can't really write really strong fiction unless you've also studied that, like that close attention to detail that poets have. I could never be a poet. Like I've written some poetry, but I appreciate it so much.
I love that you said that, Christina. I love that you said that. I started reading Sylvia Plath's poetry with a fine-tooth comb, with a magnifying glass, with like a fork and knife, just only after I started writing this novel. So I really discovered Sylvia, much like the curator does, the modern day curator in the novel really discovers Sylvia Plath and starts going really deep into her work. Sylvia was natural. You read her journals from like when she's 12 years old, and she'll describe the room that she's in. And what's amazing is that she will describe in detail, not just the lamp, but the curve of the lamp and the intricate etchings of the lamp and the wainscot of the wall and the carpet around her. And it comes to life in such a way that when she starts doing that with her poetry, it's so natural. She was so naturally good. And so right. I mean, to be able to slow down and see the poetry in everyday objects. I mean, that's what Sylvia did. She would write about a bathtub. She would write about one of her friends walking down from her room, walking down the hall and going to supper. These are like minor moments in life and yet she finds the beauty in the crack in the wall and the detail of like the roses in the roses in the pattern of the carpet, the way that her knees sort of rise above the level of the bath water. It's scrumptious. And so I mean, that taught me more about writing than anything else that I've ever done.
Yeah, she's really amazing. And the bell jar, it sticks around for a long time for a reason. My daughter and I were talking about it today because she was talking about how when she was in high school, she read it, as did I. And it was amazing to think that a lot of books kind of come and go in the high school curriculum. But it was cool to think that all those years later, that the bell jar is still something that she read and thought about.
You know,
And
I love that. And I think it's a simple story. It's not very complex.
mhm.
I was thinking about this a few days ago. So she writes this book. Sylvia, like I said, it's a memoir, right? It takes place, when she's 20 years old. And she comes in, from page 1 of this book, she's actually having a manic break. So mania is like, way up high, and you're just sort of like, you can't hold on to anything. You're just sort of like manic, and your heart rate is racing, and you're not thinking straight. And it's just boom. Page 1, she's having a manic break all the way through. Okay. Until she's not anymore. When she wrote this novel, she wasn't having a manic break. And in fact, she was having a depression. She had gone from way up here in real life down to here. So she was way down low. She was really depressed. And in fact, she wrote this book 6 months. The book came out 6 months after before she killed herself. So she was really low when she wrote this book. What's amazing to me about her craft, her ability to do what she did, she gets into the mindset of a 20-year-old girl having a manic episode, while as a writer, she is having a depressive episode. That is unbelievable. The craft in this book is this thing that lasts. It lasts the test of time. That's why.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's fascinating. I need to go reread the bell jar now too.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much I've forgotten about it. I remember thinking I'll never have that interesting of a life, and I really thought that like you needed to struggle and you need to have all these issues if you wanted to be a writer. So in some ways I felt like that it kind of glamorized for me this certain way of being an artist. And you write about that a lot in your book. You talk about what it means to be an artist, the role that art has in our culture. And there's a line that Boston Rhodes says, when she says there's no better, I have to pull this up here. There's no better inspiration than conflict, jealousy or hostility. And
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting that you're also getting at this like competitive nature. And I wonder if, if in writing, maybe a little competition isn't that bad because it makes everyone want to rise to a better level. Like to think that like the idea of crafting a story and writing sentences is something that like you can be best at, even though, but in my experience, I love supporting other writers because it feels like if my book does well, it's not going to take away from someone's book who doesn't do well. It's like
I know. This is why I love the Midwest. I'm actually from the Midwest originally, so this is why I love you so much too, because I think we have the same sentiment about helping each other sort of rise to the occasion and supporting each other. And you are genuinely that person. And so we call that being in my circle, being a good literary citizen, right? You want to do that to help other people. There is a form of creativity though, where people are fighting against each other and pushing against each other. And they do that. The idea is that in the best case scenario, that as they're pushing against each other, sort of moving up at the same time. And I think that there's something wonderful in that. I think there's something human about that. Michelangelo had, rivals. Da Vinci had rivals, and they were trying constantly to one up one another. But it was done in the spirit of trying to better themselves, and their art really, blossomed because of it. With Boston Rhodes, we see that as well. We see her work, really depends on her rivalry with Sylvia Plath. And in the few moments where she doesn't have that rivalry in her life, her poetry suffers. And then she suffers too. So she needs that poetry. She needs that rivalry. But of course, it goes to pretty some extreme lengths and extreme places. But I do think that for some people that really does work.
Yeah, I love that. And I know we're getting closer to the end of our time. So I just want to say, if you have questions, please feel free to jot them in the question section here. And I'm checking that because we want to hear from everybody. But one thing that we didn't talk about a lot, and I wonder if you could speak about it, is the third section of the book, which is what happens with this found manuscript. And I kept thinking of this phrase, objects have lives. You know, and what does it mean for an object to exist, and what should happen with the object, and how powerful are they, and who gets to care about objects? So if you could maybe just talk a little bit about like the thing that's the suspenseful part of the book is really like, what's going to happen with this manuscript?
Right.
Where was it? Who put it away? And what's going to happen?
What's going to happen? Yeah. So, I mean, the central sort of mystery of this novel is, you know, if the manuscripts randomly show up in an attic with absolutely, you know, there's no reason for it to be in this random attic in Boston. You know, what was it doing there? How did it get there? And what was the significance of it? You know, there are 3 notebooks that they find, and there's 3 stories within the, you know, the Last Confessions of Sylvia P. What I really wanted to convey was that every object has a beginning. Every object has, you know, a present life as well. And then there's the legacy of the object too. And so I wanted to take readers through that whole process. I wanted to show Sylvia Plath sitting down and finding the inspiration to build this object. And then I actually wanted to, in, you know, the middle story, really show how she was physically writing it. In the third story, which is the modern story, I wanted to talk about the legacy and how every person sort of interprets the legacy of an object differently, and they respond to it differently. Some people want to make money off of it. Some people want to own it. Some people want to hide it away and hide it from the world and just know that they own it. Some people want to study it, and other people just want to read it. What is the right thing? What does legacy really mean? And, you know, in some ways, I don't really answer that. I mean, I come to very specific conclusions, but it's a really interesting point. What is the legacy that art, you know, what's the long tail of legacy, and what can we do with that? How do we interpret that? What do we actually physically do with it when it lands in our lap as well? These are all questions that I couldn't wait to dive into. And I couldn't wait to have readers sort of figure out what happens.
And then it gets super meta, because then you have your object that you created, that's the artifact that, like, I mean, I'm obsessed with unboxing videos when writers get to box their books for the first time.
I know, it's great, right?
And it's, you know, but that's like that's that power. Like, these are the objects, and everyone responds to those. I'll watch unboxing videos all day long.
You know what? We should do a YouTube channel of just unboxing videos. I actually think that would be really, really popular. I mean, there's my kids for years were watching these unwrapping videos with kids just unwrapping toys, and that was like millions of hits. We should do unboxing videos. That's a great idea.
Should.
Okay.
Writers Unboxed. I love
Unboxed. This is great.
Yeah. All right. Started here.
Okay, it's done.
Okay, so we have some questions for you,
Yeah.
and I want to make sure we get to these. So Jill asks, would it be best to read Bell Jar before your book? And I'm so glad that you asked that, Jill, because I was thinking the same thing when I was reading it. And I also thought it would be so much fun if you were in a book club to read Bell Jar concurrently with The Last Confessions of Sylvia P, because it'd be really fun to have them in conversation with each other.
I love that question. You know, I wrote this book so that you wouldn't even have to have read the Bell Jar ever. Apologize for the dogs barking back there. You would not need to read any of her poetry. You wouldn't even have to know who Sylvia Plath was to read The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. If anything, it's sort of a primer, so that when you do start to read her work, wow, this basic scene where she's, you know, where Esther Greenwood is living in New York, working for a magazine, and she is having, you know, this sort of existential crisis in New York. Well, I just read The Last Confessions of Sylvia P, where I understood she was actually having a manic break in that moment. So then it sort of adds context to what you're reading. When she's in the hospital, the people that we read in The Last Confessions of Sylvia P actually make appearances as different characters in the Bell Jar. So I actually think you could go either way. My preference is to read it together, but certainly there's no right way or wrong way to read it.
I love that. Thanks. And I'm going to try to get my own book club to do this. So I'm really glad you asked that. And then she also asks if you've read Red Comet, and what have you read recently that you liked?
Red Comet was amazing. The Red Comet was sold the same week that mine was to different publishers. And I was thrilled. because I mean, first of all, it's a terrific book. I think it won the Pulitzer last year. It was incredible. And what I loved about it the most was that it didn't focus on Sylvia's death. You know, many people, when they think about Sylvia Plath, they think about how she died by suicide and how tragic her life was. Red Comet made the right point, which was it wasn't about her end. It was about her beginning, it was about her middle, and it was about her legacy. It doesn't matter how she died. It doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter that she died at all. You know, it's about her hope and the light that she sort of brings to the page and that we get to read all the time now. That's what I loved about her book. And it actually strongly influenced the way that I was working on the edits of my book. That said, I'm reading something completely different now. My new obsession is this book right here. It's called The Books of David. This thing is massive. It actually happened to win the Nobel Prize in Literature as well last year or this year. It's incredible. It's epic. It shows me as a writer, because I'm always learning, what you can do with an expansive story when you have sort of a length of time that you can kind of dig in and move around and get to know your characters. This book is incredible. And I'm also reading a book by a man named Sequoia. I can't remember his last name, but it's called In the Dark. Hold on. I will look this up. I will point it on my Facebook page, but it's called At Night We Rise in the Dark, or something along those lines. It's basically a series of short stories that there's an umbrella story underneath it or over it that sort of makes it a comprehensive story as well, that takes over. It lasts the length of 1,000 years. It's absolutely stunning. These books that just have sort of intricate pieces and puzzle pieces that twist and turn, they're the things that are just lighting up my imagination these days.
I'm actually not at all surprised that these are your selections. Like, I can see you doing the X-ray of the, you know, how did they structure this book?
Oh my God, it's totally true. Actually, you know, the book that there's so my book has like the 3 stories that interlock and twist and turn. I did this sort of because I fell in love with David Mitchell's novels. Most of his novels are structured so intricately and so brilliantly and beautifully. I can't help but just want to learn how he does it. But you can tell a lot of people are influenced by him, because over the last year, like Cloud Cuckoo Land, it's 3 stories that span thousands of years apart, that all thematically lock together. Also, the Over story, Richard Powers, does 7 stories that you think are individual stories that lock together as well. I think all of these are just so much fun to do and so hard to do. And I was like, you know, so those are the ones that sort of light up my mind.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for the recommendations. And then finally, Lee is asking, how do you compare the process of writing nonfiction and fiction? Which I'm really glad that Lee asked that, because your 2 books, Super Survivors and
Strange Contagion. Strange Contagion.
You know, it's so interesting to see you do both these things, nonfiction and fiction.
Yeah. So nonfiction, obviously, you have the guardrails. You got to follow the truth. You got to, you know, and fiction, you don't. And that took me a long time to figure out. Like, the minute I realized, you know, I don't have to get at the truth here. I just need to capture the essence of the truth when I'm talking about something. That did it for me. That's the difference between my nonfiction and fiction. My nonfiction has always been narrative based, like really strongly narrative based. I care so much more about the stories than the facts themselves, which I think when I was running my nonfiction, my editor kept on saying, yeah, get back to the facts. Mm-hmm. So by the time I started writing fiction, I was like, you know what? I just want my characters to do something that I want them to do, that drives the story forward. And so that was my process. It was sort of like, you know, I just want to be able to tell the story the way the story needs to be told. It was, you know, nonfiction, there's a lot of guardrails, but I'll tell you, the researching process for both fiction and nonfiction is both equally as intense. I think I spent something like a year researching this novel before I even put one word to page. Nonfiction, it's basically 18 months of deep research before you start writing.
So many rabbit holes. I love doing the research. And
yeah.
I know that we're going to be closing up. So I just have one last thing to ask, or one last thing to say, which is, this book is so great. And it would be so great to buy it from Boswell Books, because Boswell is just so supportive of writers, and to have you come to this virtual event is so great. And it's so nice to reward Boswell by buying your book at the store. And Lee, I really hope you can come to Milwaukee and visit Boswell.
I cannot wait. Can I tell you, I'm actually getting on my first flight in 2.5 years next week. So I will be flying around and starting to come to places in person. So it's going to be great. I can't wait to do it. I'm doing this thing for National Poetry Month, which starts tomorrow, actually, that anybody who has a book group that reads this book, I'm happy to join for 30 minutes at the end of each book group, just to sort of answer any questions as well. So feel free to use that as well for the month of April.
Oh, that's so great. The perfect timing with Poetry Month coming.
Yeah.
One person just said that they're going to snag the audiobook. Some people don't know about Libro FM. It's Libro, Libro.fm. It's the same thing as Audible, except you can pick a bookseller or a bookstore to support when you get the audiobook. So you get the exact same audiobooks, you get great deals on them. But then you can say Boswell Books is the bookseller that you want to support. It's the best service. I'm completely obsessed with it. I tell it to everyone I know to get it, because I mix my hardcover and my print and my audio.
It's called
Libro.fm.
How do you, what is it?
It's Libro.fm.
Libro book. That's wonderful. And it's funny, the audiobook version of this, which I had nothing to do with except just through my publisher, just won a major industry award. So apparently the voice actors who do the book are terrific. We actually have the same
Backer.
Yeah, she's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So they're so good. They just won an award, which is amazing. So I highly encourage you listening to the audiobook if you can.
And now that we have the same audiobook narrator, we're kind of related too.
I think we sort of are. I mean, we have the same Midwest mentality and sort of disposition. I think it's good.
Yeah. And we're campers.
We're campers. We go back. We go back.
Oh, well, this is such a treat. And I am so pleased that everybody joined us. Thank you for coming. This is a fascinating discussion, and I enjoyed every second of it. And yes, by The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. from Daniel Golden.
And
or your favorite
Christina's book. It's wonderful. Both of her books are fantastic. One of them is going to be made into a TV movie. Is that correct?
TV series, yeah.
TV series with the Game of Thrones guy, which is awesome. Fantastic. I can't wait. I'm so in love with your work. I'm thrilled that we got to do this together. Boswell Books, thank you so much. Daniel, you were awesome. Thank you for hosting.
Thank you, Will. It was an honor to have both of you. Hope to see another event. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And looking forward to, shoulder season. It's just moments until it's in paperback, it feels like. So.
Yeah, July 12th, I think.
Oh my God,
and
really?
A new cover. It's pretty sexy.
Yes.
So.
Very nice.
Sex up.
This is great. Loved your book. Loved it.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thank you.